A routine court case, or so it seemed, when a young black boy was wrongly accused and thrown into a system rigged against him. But they had no idea who they were dealing with, because this boy isn't just any kid. He carries the strength and legacy of those who refuse to be broken. What unfolds next is a gripping fight against power, injustice, and cold, hard truth. And trust me, you won't see the ending coming until we dive deep into this story. So while you settle in, tell us what time is it, where you are, and where are you tuning in from? Drop a comment below, we'd love to hear your voice and connect with you. It was a quiet Wednesday afternoon in Magnolia, Georgia, the kind where the sun hung heavy and low, casting long, sleepy shadows across the cracked sidewalks and the rusted chain-link fences that lined the yards like forgotten boundaries. Darius Wells, a 14-year-old boy with a slow, thoughtful stride, walked alone down Sycamore Street, his backpack snug against his shoulders, his shoes scuffing lightly against the pavement with every step. The neighborhood had that kind of stillness that comes just after school. Lets out bikes leaned against porches, screen doors creaked open and shut, and somewhere in the distance, a lawnmower sputtered and hummed, blending into the hush like background music nobody noticed. Darius didn't talk much, didn't move fast, didn't like trouble, and did everything he could to avoid it. But trouble, as he was learning, didn't always wait for you to invite it. It had a way of finding you when your hands were full and your head was somewhere else. He glanced down at the slip of paper his grandmother had given him that morning, her handwriting a mix of loops and sharp corners, the kind of writing that came from a different generation, firm, careful, and never in a rush. Pick up her prescription at Lacey's pharmacy before 5. Come straight home. No detours. That was Marcia Wells, his grandmother, his whole world since his mother passed 3 years ago. She was firm, too, and Darius respected her for it, even when she didn't understand what it was like to be young and black in a town where every sideways glance from a stranger felt like a quiet warning. His phone buzzed in his pocket, but he ignored it. One job, one errand, that's all he had to do. Just get to the pharmacy, get the pills, and get back home before the air turned too thick and the wrong eyes landed on him. As he neared the corner store, Gus's Market, the only place in town that still sold popsicles for under $1, he heard the clatter of something hitting the ground, a sharp sound plastic on tile followed by muffled laughter. He turned his head just enough to see 2 white boys, maybe 16, maybe 17, bolt from the doorway, one of them glancing back with a crooked grin and a nod toward Darius. His gut tightened instantly, instinctually, before he even understood why. The cashier, a wiry man with a sunken jaw and nicotine-stained fingertips, stepped from behind the counter, his gaze snapping straight to Darius like a magnet. You see that the man barked, his voice rough like gravel in a tin can. You part of that little show just now? Darius blinked, confused, then shook his head. I didn't even go in. I just... The man cut in his boots, scraping against the concrete as he stepped outside, eyes narrowing. Then what's that fallen out of your pocket? Darius looked down in disbelief to see a leather wallet half tucked under the flap of his backpack. His stomach dropped. His hands went instinctively to the straps, but he froze, because movement, even innocent movement, got misunderstood too easily around here. That's not mine, he said, his voice low but steady, trying to keep the shaking out of it. Somebody must have— Don't play dumb boy, the man snapped. You know exactly what this is. And that word boy hung in the air like something poisonous, something rotten. Not just an insult, but a dismissal, a sentence without trial. A neighbor across the street peeked through her blinds, then disappeared. A man loading groceries paused just long enough to take in the scene before turning away. The silence of the street deepened into something heavier, something Darius could feel pressing against his skin. He knew what was coming next before he heard the sound. A low, rising whine. Tires scraping asphalt. The flashing of blue lights bouncing off windows like thunder before the storm. A sheriff's cruiser swung around the block, and Deputy Brad Hewley stepped out like he'd been waiting all day for something like this. Broad shoulders, mirrored sunglasses, and the kind of walk that said he had nothing to prove to anyone except maybe boys like Darius. What's going on here? Hewley asked, his eyes already locked on Darius like the question was rhetorical. Caught him stealing, the cashier said quickly. These kids think we don't notice. Look at him. Look at what's in his bag. I didn't steal anything, Darius said, more loudly this time, heart racing now, every instinct screaming to run but knowing better. I didn't even go inside. The wallet ain't mine. Hewley stepped closer, his shadow falling over the boy. You lying to me, son? No seer. Then you won't mind if I check? Darius hesitated just a second, maybe less, but that was enough. The deputy's hand was already on his shoulder, spinning him around with a grip that wasn't careful. Cold metal clamped tight around one wrist, then the other. Hands behind your back. But I didn't. You got the right to remain silent, Hewley muttered, tone flat mechanical. Might as well start using it. The cuffs bit into his skin as the deputy marched him toward the cruiser, the heat of the pavement rising through his shoes, through his legs, all the way into his chest. He wanted to shout, to beg someone to speak up, to say they saw what really happened, but nobody did. The world just watched the way it always had, and the sky above seemed to darken a shade even though the sun was still burning. As the car door slammed behind him and the lock clicked shut, Darius sat with his head turned toward the window, his hands burning his pulse loud in his ears. Through the glass, he saw the paper with his grandmother's handwriting flutter from his pocket and drift toward the gutter. He closed his eyes and tried not to cry. The cruiser's interior smelled faintly of sun-baked vinyl and something sterile like the echo of cleaning fluid that never fully masked the staleness of what had come before. Darius sat stiffly in the back seat, hands cuffed behind him, arms pulled too tight for comfort, the metal biting deeper into his skin every time the car hit a bump in the road. His cheek rested against the window, warm from the afternoon sun, and he watched as the neighborhood passed by in slow, disconnected fragments. Familiar porches, cracked driveways, and old trees that bent over the sidewalk like they were trying to shield someone from the weight of the world. He didn't speak. Neither did Officer Hewley. The silence between them was thick unspoken, and filled with assumptions the kind that didn't need to be said out loud because they were already understood. At one point Darius whispered, "Can you at least call my grandma?" But the words just floated in the air and fell flat, ignored like static on the radio. Hewley kept driving, one hand on the wheel, the other resting casually near his holster, his face unreadable behind the reflection of his mirrored sunglasses. When they reached the station, the engine's low rumble died out, and the door clicked open with a sudden mechanical finality that made Darius flinch. Not because it was loud, but because it meant everything was real. Now, no longer a mistake that could be laughed off or explained away. Hewley yanked the back door wide, his voice curt. Out. Darius slid out awkwardly, wrists still bound behind his back, and struggled to find his balance. The pavement was hot, and the sun pressed down like it had joined the weight on his shoulders. Inside the precinct, the air was cooler, but no more welcoming. Fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting a pale green tinge over the gray floors and beige walls, and the scent of coffee and floor wax mingled in a way that felt both mundane and menacing. They didn't ask questions. They didn't ask for his side. They didn't offer him water or let him call home. They took his backpack, his shoes, and even the slip of paper with his grandmother's handwriting that someone must have retrieved from the sidewalk. An officer at the desk, a woman with tired eyes and a wedding ring twisted nervously on her finger, asked, "Name?" without looking up. "Darius Wells," he answered softly, and when she typed it in, it was like the system swallowed it whole, transforming him from a boy to a file number with one tap of the enter key. The next hour blurred into a series of instructions barked with mechanical efficiency. Stand here, face the camera, hands flat on the table. He didn't fight back, didn't argue, just obeyed, but even that didn't seem to matter. He watched as they fingerprinted him, each finger pressed down with indifference, and then the flash of a camera stunned his vision as they took his mugshot without even asking him to fix his collar. When it was over, he was led down a narrow hallway past closed doors and faded posters about youth reform and second chances that no one in that building seemed to believe in anymore. In the holding cell, the door shut behind him with a clang that echoed too loud in the small space. The bench was cold, and metal bolted to the floor, and the air smelled faintly of sweat and Lysol. Darius sat down slowly, trying to stretch his shoulders without showing how much the cuffs hurt. Another boy, maybe a year older, lay on the other bench with his hoodie pulled over his head, pretending to sleep, but Darius could see one eye cracked open, watching cautious. Nobody said anything. There was nothing to say. The clock on the wall ticked too loudly. Each second felt like a small punch, a reminder that time was passing but nothing was moving forward. He leaned back, his head resting against the wall, and closed his eyes, trying to steady his breathing. He thought of his grandmother, probably waiting for him by the window, her hands clenched around that same rotary phone she refused to replace. He thought of her pacing the living room, checking the clock, calling the pharmacy, calling neighbors, maybe even walking to the police station if no one answered. He knew how that would go. He knew how they'd look at her. Somewhere down the hallway, two officers were laughing, deep, careless chuckles echoing off tile, and then a voice floated down low and sharp. "Judge Cormac. Oh yeah, he don't play with kids like that." The words sank like stones in Darius's stomach. He'd heard the name before, not from school or television, but from church folks, warning each other quietly, like sharing stories about a ghost that still haunted the county courthouse. Judge Luther Cormac, the kind of man whose decisions couldn't be appealed with logic or fairness, only feared. Darius opened his eyes slowly and stared up at the cracked ceiling, its surface dim and uneven like the sky outside just before a storm. He wondered what would happen if he just disappeared in here, if no one called, no one cared, if his name stayed in a file cabinet until someone forgot why it was even there. He shifted on the bench, pulling his knees up to his chest, and for the first time in a long time he let himself feel small. The tough skin he'd built up, the quiet, polite, responsible version of himself that he carried, like armor, felt thinner now, like paper wet from the rain. In his pocket, barely noticeable, and somehow still with him, was the photo. He hadn't even remembered he had it until now. His fingers, still cuffed, reached awkwardly toward the fabric of his jeans, feeling for the familiar edge. It was old and soft, and folded so many times it felt like cloth. His mother's face, her military uniform crisp, her smile full of life and promise, stood beside his baby self, swaddled in her arms. He held it close not to show anyone, but because it reminded him that he wasn't invisible, that he came from something. As he closed his eyes again, letting the photo rest against his chest, a low voice from the other bench spoke for the first time. "First time in here?" Darius didn't answer right away. He took a breath and said, "Yeah." The other boy grunted, "Same." And just like that, for a moment, the silence didn't feel so lonely. They called it a juvenile holding cell, but to Darius it felt more like a waiting room for the forgotten, a concrete box, painted in institutional gray, lit by a flickering fluorescent bulb that buzzed like a dying insect, and filled with a kind of silence that didn't come from peace but from resignation. He sat curled on the edge of the metal bench, arms wrapped around his knees, chin resting just above the hard ridge of bone, and stared straight ahead at nothing in particular. His wrists still stung from the cuffs, and the imprint they left felt like a mark that would take more than soap and water to erase. The boy from earlier, the one with the hoodie pulled over his face, had fallen asleep for real now, his breathing deep and steady, but Darius couldn't close his eyes no matter how heavy they felt. The voices from the hallway carried through the vent above the door, muffled but clear enough to sting. One man chuckled a short, sharp sound. "That's the Wells boy," he said. "Judge Cormac's gonna eat him alive." The other one responded with a laugh that was quieter, almost like pity. "Yeah. You know how he is with these kids." Darius didn't move, didn't flinch, but inside the words cracked something open. These kids, he knew exactly what they meant. Not just poor kids. Not just kids without lawyers. Not just kids who didn't know the system. No black kids. Kids who walked into a courtroom and were judged before they ever opened their mouths. Kids like him. He thought of his grandma then, of the way she'd tighten her lips every time someone on the news said another one, and how she'd always shake her head slowly and say, "They don't see us, baby. Not really." He'd never understood what she meant when he was younger, not fully. But now, sitting in that cell, the realization hit hard and cold. She wasn't just talking about the police or the system or even the courts. She was talking about the way the world looked at boys like him, as if they were already broken, already guilty, already on a path they didn't choose but were expected to follow. When the cell door creaked open, Darius blinked once, then sat up a little straighter. A tall officer with thinning blonde hair and a badge that read Delaney stood in the doorway holding a clipboard. "Wells," he said, his voice flat. "Your hearing's set for tomorrow morning. You got a public defender assigned." Darius didn't respond at first, then asked quietly, "Can I call my grandma?" Delaney gave him a long, unreadable look, then shrugged. "They'll let you make one call before bed. Don't get your hopes up about that lawyer, though. She's got 10 kids just like you on her desk." Then he closed the door with a click that sounded more like a verdict than a courtesy. Hours passed, maybe more, until another officer came to collect him, this one younger, with headphones dangling around his neck and a bored expression on his face. He led Darius down a hallway that smelled like dust and bleach, into a small room with a metal phone mounted to the wall and a scratched-up plexiglass window separating the booths. "You get 5 minutes," the officer said, tapping his watch. Darius picked up the receiver with shaking fingers, and dialed the number he'd memorized years ago, his grandmother's landline, the one she refused to replace even when it crackled during thunderstorms. It rang twice, then a voice answered, rushed and breathless. "Hello," Darius tried to speak, but the words caught in his throat. "Grandma, it's me," he finally whispered. The silence on the other end broke with a gasp. "Baby, oh Lord, I've been calling everywhere. I didn't know where you were, they wouldn't tell me." "They arrested me," he said, voice low and tight. "They think I stole something, but I didn't. I swear." She paused just long enough for him to hear the worry settling in her bones. "I know you didn't, baby. I know. Just hold on. I'm gonna find a way." Then the officer tapped the glass and the call went dead. Back in the cell, Darius sat quietly, the phone conversation playing over and over in his head like a recording he couldn't shut off. He didn't cry. He hadn't cried in a long time. But something in his chest tightened every time he thought about the way her voice cracked when she said, "Hold on." He reached into the back pocket of his jeans, still miraculously unconfiscated, and pulled out the folded photograph. The edges were worn smooth from years of handling, and the image inside was faded, but clear. His mother in uniform, standing tall, one arm cradling a baby, and the other resting at her side like a soldier. She looked proud. She looked brave. She looked like someone who would have torn the whole damn jail apart just to find her son. A sudden sound outside the cell made him look up, a heavy door slamming somewhere down the hall, followed by footsteps that echoed with slow, deliberate weight. Two voices again, this time closer. "You hear who's got his case?" one asked. The other laughed. "Cormac. Kid's toast." The voices faded, but the echo remained. Judge Luther Cormac. A name that carried weight in Magnolia. A man who'd built his reputation on being tough on crime, though nobody ever asked what kind of crime he meant. Darius had seen him on the local news, once shaking hands with politicians and warning about rising threats to our community. Now he realized what that meant. He was the threat. He lay back down on the bench, the photograph still in his hand, and stared at the ceiling until the paint above him blurred into a blank wash of gray. His thoughts drifted to the courtroom, to the faces he would see, to the words he would try to say that no one would believe. But somewhere underneath the fear, buried deep beneath the exhaustion and the shame, a spark began to stir, a small, steady flicker of something unyielding. Not anger, not yet, but the beginning of defiance. And when he finally closed his eyes, the last thing he saw in the dark was his mother's face looking straight ahead like she knew he wasn't done. The courthouse smelled like old wood-polished stone, and the kind of paper that's been handled too many times by too many hands. Darius sat at the defendant's table, the fabric of his borrowed shirt stiff around the collar, his hands resting flat on his knees to keep them from shaking. He was trying not to breathe too loud, not to look too lost, not to give away the storm gathering behind his eyes. Around him, the room buzzed with the quiet hum of bureaucratic indifference, whispers between clerks, the clicking of pens, the distant echo of a printer somewhere down the hall, spitting out someone else's future. Judge Luther Cormac had not yet entered, but the energy in the room already shifted in anticipation, like people were bracing for a storm they knew they couldn't outrun. Next to him sat Celeste Rankin, the court-appointed lawyer who had met Darius for the first time less than an hour ago in a hallway that smelled like sweat and bleach. She was a woman in her late 50s with tired eyes behind thin glasses and folders tucked under both arms like shields. "Listen to me," she had whispered, before they entered, her voice low and direct. "You don't speak unless I tell you to. Don't react. Don't look angry. Don't look scared. Just stay still." Darius had nodded, not because he agreed, but because he didn't know what else to do. He didn't feel angry, not yet. Mostly he felt like a person underwater, every sound muffled, every breath, a struggle. When Judge Cormac entered, the bailiff called the room to order with a voice that tried to sound commanding but cracked slightly at the end. The judge's black robe swirled around his polished shoes like a slow-moving shadow, and his face was as still as stone, carved into an expression that told you long before he opened his mouth that he had no time for explanations. He sat down with the weight of someone who had done this 1,000 times before and never once changed his mind. "Case number 8821, the clerk announced, State of Georgia versus Darius Wells." Cormac barely nodded, scanning the room with eyes that seemed to pierce straight through paper, skin, and circumstance. Celeste cleared her throat and stood offering the court a tight, professional smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Your Honor, the defendant pleads not guilty. There is no physical evidence, no witness statement, and the security footage from the store has not been submitted for review. The judge leaned forward, slightly steepling his fingers. "Did the defendant resist arrest?" he asked, his voice low and deliberate. "No, Your Honor," she replied carefully. "He complied with every instruction, but he did not agree to a search." Cormac added, eyes flicking down to the file. He hesitated. Darius's jaw tensed, but he said nothing. Celeste placed a calming hand on his arm. "He was confused, sir. He had no reason to believe he had done anything wrong." Cormac leaned back, unimpressed. "Confusion is not an excuse for defiance," he said, as if quoting a scripture only he believed in. "And I see here he has previous school infractions. Detention, tardiness, skipping class." Celeste took a breath, the kind that carried more weight than air. "Your Honor, those were the result of family circumstances. His guardian is elderly, and the boy helps care for her. He has no criminal record." Cormac waved a hand dismissively, as if batting away a fly. "Let's be honest with each other, counselor," he said. "We know the trajectory of boys like this. The details may differ, but the outcomes rarely do." The courtroom fell silent, not because of shock, but because no one there found those words unusual, just familiar, expected, normal. Darius stared at the floor, his heart pounding like it wanted to leave his chest, his mind replaying the words "boys like this," like there was already a road paved beneath his feet, and every step he took was just a delay in reaching the inevitable end. Celeste sat down beside him slowly, her mouth a thin line, her fingers twitching with the urge to do more than the system would allow. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "He's already made up his mind." Darius didn't look at her. His eyes were fixed on the bench in front of him, where the wood grain curled like a map of somewhere he would never reach. He thought of his grandmother sitting in the back row, her small frame swallowed by the weight of the courtroom, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles had turned white. He thought of the way she always made coffee in silence on mornings when the news told stories that hit too close to home. Then he looked back at Judge Cormac, who was now reading something aloud about court dates and evaluations, his voice a dull monotone that rang through the courtroom like the tick of a clock in an empty room. Darius couldn't hear the words "not really." They passed over him like smoke. What he heard instead was the cold certainty behind them, the kind of certainty that didn't need facts, just patterns. Patterns built on skin zip code and silence. And in that silence something shifted inside him, not loudly, not with a roar, but quietly, like a door being closed and locked from the inside. Not because he was giving up, but because he had finally seen it for what it was. This wasn't about guilt or innocence. It wasn't about law or order. It was about control, about keeping people like him in place. As the judge dismissed the room and the bailiff approached with keys for the shackles, Darius stood slowly, legs steady, eyes unblinking. He didn't flinch when the cuffs snapped around his wrists. He didn't lower his gaze when the officer grabbed his arm, and he didn't speak. Because there was nothing left to say to men who only heard what they already believed. He walked out of the courtroom with quiet steps, his heart no longer pounding but pacing slow and deliberate, like it was waiting for something bigger, something worth breaking for. The morning of the bail hearing was colder than it should have been for early spring in Georgia, a sharp breeze sweeping through the open courtyard of the courthouse like a quiet warning whispered through iron bars. Darius stood at the threshold of the courtroom, his wrists bound once more in stainless steel cuffs that had become too familiar, the short chain clinking softly with every cautious movement of his arms. His feet shuffled against the polished floor, the soles of his county-issued shoes squeaking faintly, and for a moment the sound seemed louder than the nervous murmurs coming from the pew-like benches where strangers whispered their judgments they didn't bother disguising. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered intermittently, casting odd shadows across the tiled floor, and the whole room smelled faintly of paper, ink, and the slow erosion of hope. His grandmother sat quietly in the back row, her hands folded tightly on her lap, back straight eyes, fixed on him in a way that didn't beg or plead, but simply reminded him she was there. That had always been her way, unwavering, unbending, even when her heart was breaking behind the steady rise and fall of her breath. Celeste Rankin stood beside him, flipping through her folder with practiced ease, but her face carried the fatigue of a woman who had read too many case files that all ended the same way. "Today's about keeping you close," she whispered without looking up. "If they deny bail, it won't be long before they start treating you like a conviction instead of a person." Darius didn't respond. He didn't know what words he could offer that wouldn't sound hollow or afraid. Instead, he just nodded once slowly, like he was promising to listen, even if he didn't believe. When Judge Cormac entered, the bailiff announced him with a tone of forced reverence, and the room stood like it was following an old ritual no one believed in anymore. The judge's robe fluttered slightly behind him as he took his seat, and he didn't look at anyone in particular as he scanned the case summary with the casual precision of a man browsing a menu he'd already memorized. Darius felt the judge's eyes brush over him briefly, just enough to assess, to categorize, to confirm whatever assumption had already been made in the silence between court dates. Miss Rankin, the judge began, his voice low and flat. "You're requesting bail for the defendant." Celeste stepped forward, her voice firm but respectful. "Yes, Your Honor. Mr. Wells has no criminal record, resides with a stable guardian, and poses no flight risk. He's a minor, a student, and should not be held in a facility that compromises his physical or emotional safety." Cormac raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed. And yet he resisted a lawful stop, refused to comply with a store employee's request, and delayed an officer's search. He was scared, she said evenly, not skipping a beat. As any child would be when treated like a suspect before being asked a single question. The prosecutor, an older man with a smug expression and a tie too bright for the room, rose and cleared his throat. "Your Honor, we believe the defendant presents a risk not because of his past, but because of what we see as a developing pattern of defiance. His school record indicates repeated tardiness, unexplained absences, disciplinary referrals, behavior consistent with escalating delinquency." Darius felt his jaw tighten, his hands curling slightly into fists behind the cuffs, but he said nothing. He didn't look back at his grandmother. He didn't want her to see the shame burning behind his eyes, even though none of it should have been his to carry. Celeste interrupted sharply. "Your Honor, those school incidents were the result of caregiving obligations. He helps his grandmother, who is elderly and has limited mobility. He missed school to take her to medical appointments, not to skip class. There's no evidence of theft, no prior police contact. And most importantly, no justification for detaining a child who's done nothing but struggle under circumstances he didn't choose." Cormac leaned back in his chair, his fingers tapping rhythmically against the wood of his desk. The silence stretched long and thin like a tightrope between judgment and mercy. Then he looked directly at Darius, and something in his expression changed. Not compassion, not curiosity, but certainty. "Mr. Wells," he said slowly, "I'm denying bail. I find the risk of further delinquent behavior sufficient, and I believe continued custody serves both his interest and the safety of the community." The words didn't land like a surprise. They didn't even land like a blow. They settled into Darius's chest like cold water soaking through cloth, gradual, inevitable, and heavy, in a way that made breathing feel like work. He didn't speak. He didn't move. He just stood there as the bailiff approached again with the key in one hand and the same indifferent look in the other. Behind him he could hear the muffled sound of his grandmother, exhaling not loudly but with a tremor that echoed louder than any shout. As they led him out of the courtroom, Celeste whispered, "We'll appeal. This isn't over." But Darius didn't nod this time. He didn't respond. He let the door close behind him with a soft, deliberate thud and walked the hallway with his eyes forward, his shoulders drawn inward, and his silence wrapped tight around him like a second skin. He was starting to understand that the system didn't break in obvious ways. It bent, it pressed, it reshaped you slowly, not with violence but with indifference, until you began to doubt whether your side of the story was ever worth telling in the first place. And as they led him back through the steel doors past the security scanners and down the long hallway toward the juvenile transport, Van Darius glanced once over his shoulder toward the stained glass window above the main entrance, sunlight filtering through it like something beautiful that didn't belong there anymore. He didn't look for his grandmother in the parking lot. He didn't expect to see her face pressed to the glass. But he carried her voice inside his head, quiet but steady the way she always said. "You hold your head up even when the world tries to push it down." And in that moment, even as the cuffs clicked tighter and the world moved on like his story had already been written, Darius straightened his spine, took a slow breath, and looked ahead, not because he had hope, but because he refused to let them see him bow. The night inside the detention center was thick with a silence that pressed down like weight, not air, and Darius lay awake on the hard, narrow cot, with his eyes wide open, staring at the cracked ceiling above him, like it might split in two and offer some way out. The mattress was thin, barely more than a pad, and each time he shifted the metal frame groaned under him like an old man, protesting the years echoing faintly against the cinder-block walls. Somewhere down the hall, a toilet flushed with a sudden roar that faded just as quickly into the oppressive stillness, followed by a cough, then footsteps, then nothing. He had counted every sound, since lights out, like keeping score against his own thoughts, might help slow them down, but they moved fast, flashes of memory, fear, and something colder that sat just beneath his skin. He reached into his pocket, careful not to draw attention from the hallway camera, and felt the corner of the photograph that had somehow stayed with him through booking and searches. The edges were soft now, curved from years of being folded and refolded, carried like a secret between him and the world. His mother stared back at him from the image younger than he remembered her in life. Her army uniform crisp, her smile, steady one arm, holding a baby version of himself, who didn't yet know what justice looked like, or what it felt like to be without it. Darius stared at the photo until his vision blurred not from tears but from the exhaustion of pretending he was fine. That morning, before they loaded him into the van to take him to court, he'd overheard two guards talking near the front desk, one of them young, the other older, with a voice like sandpaper and a laugh that never reached his eyes. "You see the file on that Wells kid?" the younger one had asked. The older man grunted. "Yeah. Another one bound for the system. Cormac'll have him straightened out." Then they both laughed, not cruelly, just casually, like they'd seen this story too many times to feel anything about it anymore. Darius hadn't moved. He had sat perfectly still in the plastic chair, his wrists resting in his lap, pretending not to hear, but every word sank like lead into his chest. Now, in the middle of the night, that conversation looped in his mind like a warning, and he felt the stirrings of something he couldn't name. Wasn't anger, wasn't sadness, but something heavier and quieter, like the slow, deliberate tightening of a knot. He thought of his grandmother again, how she always said, "They'll try to shrink you down, baby. Try to fold you into a version of yourself that fits their story. But you don't have to let them." He didn't know if he believed that anymore, but he wanted to. There was a soft knock at the cell door, 2 quick taps, then silence. Darius sat up slowly, unsure if he imagined it, but then the key rattled in the lock and the door creaked open just far enough for a voice to slip through. "Carter," someone whispered. "You got a visitor." That didn't make sense. He wasn't supposed to have a visit until after the arraignment. He blinked into the hallway light, his body sluggish from hours of stillness, and followed the officer, this one unfamiliar older with a badge that read S. Griggs and a limp in his left leg. The hallway to the visitation room was colder than his cell, lined with pale green walls that peeled at the corners and buzzed with tired fluorescent lights. When they reached the room, he was led to a narrow metal stool across from a thick pane of plexiglass, and it took him a second to register the figure sitting on the other side. A woman, maybe in her 50s, wearing a dark blazer over a floral blouse, folders stacked beside her like bricks. She had silver streaks in her tightly pulled back hair, and her expression was calm but firm. "Darius," she said gently through the receiver, "my name is Reverend Thomas. Your grandmother asked me to come." Darius picked up the phone, slowly unsure of what to say. "Is she okay?" he asked. The woman nodded. "She's okay. She's fighting for you, but she's worried and she wanted someone to check on you before the hearing." Darius swallowed hard. "She doesn't have to, she does." Reverend Thomas cut in not unkindly. "Because she loves you, and because you're not alone in this, even if it feels that way right now." They talked for 10 minutes about the case, about the judge, about what was likely to happen and what might still be changed. Reverend Thomas spoke with the kind of quiet authority that didn't try to soften the truth but didn't make it cruel either. She told him about a lawyer who might be willing to look deeper, about community leaders watching the case, about how sometimes one story could force open a crack in a system that thought it was unshakable. Before she left, she said something that stuck. "You've got to hold on to who you are, even when they try to name you something else." Back in his cell, Darius sat on the edge of the cot and held the photo again, this time not just for comfort but for grounding. He stared at his mother's eyes, so familiar, so steady, and tried to imagine what she would say if she could sit across from him now. Maybe nothing. Maybe she'd just look at him and nod once like she always did when she wanted him to know he was doing fine, even when everything around him was broken. The lights in the hallway clicked off one by one, leaving the block in shadows, broken only by the occasional red flicker from the security camera. Darius lay back the photograph, still clutched in one hand beneath his pillow, and stared into the darkness, not looking for answers, but for resolve. And when his eyes finally closed, the sound of the door clicking shut earlier, that quiet snick of steel meeting steel, echoed once more in his mind, not as a threat, but as a reminder that tomorrow the fight would begin all over again, and he'd be ready. The courtroom felt colder that morning, not because of the air conditioning, but because of something deeper, something in the walls, in the way the bailiff's voice echoed flatly when he called the session to order, in the way the light coming through the windows looked too white, too clinical, like it was filtering through something more sterile than glass. Darius stood quietly between his attorney and the officer who had brought him in from the holding cell, his hands cuffed again, his wrists already beginning to feel the familiar pressure of the metal cutting slightly into his skin. He didn't flinch, he didn't speak. He had learned by now that in places like this, the quieter you were, the more intact you might stay. Celeste Rankin stood to his right, her posture firm despite the fatigue etched into her every movement, her blazer creased from long hours and longer battles, her folder open in front of her, like a shield she knew wouldn't be enough. "We are here, Your Honor," she began, her voice steady, "to present arguments against the detainment of a minor without physical evidence, without a formal charge, and with clear indication of judicial bias." Judge Cormack didn't even look up right away. He adjusted his glasses, scribbled something onto a yellow legal pad, and then finally glanced over the top rim of his spectacles with the kind of slow, dismissive gaze that made Darius feel like a line item rather than a life. "I've reviewed the file," the judge said, his voice as dry as paper left too long in the sun. "I see no grounds for reconsideration. His behavior, both prior and current, suggests a pattern, a trajectory, one I've seen many times." Celeste didn't sit. "With respect, sir," she said, "you are not referencing legal precedent, you are referencing perception. That is not the same as law." The judge's expression didn't change, but something in the room shifted, a subtle tightening of the space, like the air had grown heavier even though no one had moved. Behind them, in the rows of benches reserved for the public, Marcia Wells sat like a pillar carved from something older than fear, her coat buttoned to her neck, her hands resting motionless in her lap, but her eyes locked on her grandson, like she was anchoring him to something stronger than the floor beneath his feet. Next to her sat Reverend Thomas. His jaw clenched, the lines in his face, deepened by a night spent organizing phone calls, emails, and last-minute support from anyone willing to listen. The prosecutor, a man with a graying beard and a tie that seemed too cheerful for the gravity of the room, finally stood and added, "The boy was found at the scene. Whether or not an item was recovered is secondary to his failure to comply, his record of disruptive conduct, and his defiance of authority figures." Darius felt the words settle into his body like cold water dripping into his collar, each one a carefully sharpened stone dropped in slow succession, meant not to crush, but to wear him down. Celeste turned to Darius, then her voice soft but clear. "Do you have anything you wish to say to the court, Darius?" He didn't hesitate. His voice was low but not weak, each word chosen like it cost him something to speak it. "I didn't steal anything. I didn't lie. I was just trying to get home." He looked straight ahead, not at the judge but at no one in particular, as if the truth didn't need to land anywhere to still be true. Cormack leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. "Intent doesn't erase behavior," he said, as if reading from a rulebook only he had access to. Then after a long pause he added, "The request for release is denied. The defendant will remain in custody until a formal hearing is scheduled." The gavel didn't slam down, not this time. It dropped with a dull finality, like the close of a door no one wanted to open again. A hush fell across the room, not silence but something softer and heavier, disappointment thickening in the air like humidity before a storm. Celeste sat down slowly, her hands falling into her lap, her eyes closed for just a breath longer than usual. Darius didn't react. He just turned slightly enough to catch his grandmother's gaze. She gave him one nod, barely perceptible but full of something ancient and unbreakable. As the bailiff approached, unlocking the chain that held him to the table and reattaching the cuffs for transport, Darius kept his head up, his spine straight. He didn't fight. He didn't resist. But inside, something had calcified, something quiet but undeniable. Not hate, not despair. Just clarity, the kind that settles into your bones when you realize the world doesn't plan to save you, so you'd better learn how to stand without it. In the hallway outside the courtroom, the light felt too bright again, artificial and harsh against the dull beige of the walls. A group of officers stood at the end, talking quietly among themselves, casting glances that bounced off Darius like pebbles thrown into a pond that had already frozen over. He ignored them. He followed the bailiff down the corridor, past the faded posters about second chances and rehabilitation, past the waiting rooms filled with hopeful families, and back into the van that smelled of vinyl steel and resignation. As the door slammed shut behind him, he stared at the scratched window and watched the courthouse fade into the distance, not with sorrow, not with rage, but with a steadiness that frightened even him. He had walked in that morning hoping for something, maybe fairness, maybe mercy, but now he carried something else entirely. The weight of knowing that survival wasn't just about enduring what they did to him. It was about refusing to become what they expected. And as the van turned the corner and the last sliver of the courthouse disappeared from view, Darius exhaled slowly, letting the breath fill his lungs with something sharper than air. Resolve. Quiet and unforgiving. Like steel cooled in shadow. The lights in the juvenile detention center flickered overhead with a dull persistence, humming softly like an old machine that had never truly stopped running. Darius sat on the edge of his cot, elbows resting on his knees, his fingers loosely interlaced, eyes staring down at the gray linoleum floor that stretched like a road to nowhere. The sounds of the other boys drifted in from down the hall, low, murmurs, an occasional burst of laughter too sharp to be genuine, followed by silence thick enough to feel like pressure in the room. It was a place designed to keep time still, to dull the edges of memory, and convince you that life on the outside had always been a dream too far to reach. Across from him sat Trey, a kid, maybe a year older, maybe a year younger. It was hard to tell in here where everything was filtered through tired eyes and sagging shoulders. Trey had skin the color of deep bronze, his hair twisted into short coils that flattened a little on one side where he'd been lying too long against the pillow. He was quiet most of the time, but tonight something had changed in the way he kept glancing toward Darius, like he was trying to figure out if the question he wanted to ask was worth the weight of the answer. "You ever been here before?" Trey asked finally, his voice a low rasp like it hadn't been used for real conversation in days. Darius shook his head, slow and deliberate. "First time," he said, and then added after a breath, "Didn't think I'd ever be." Trey smirked without humor, rubbing his thumb along a faded scar on his forearm. "Nobody does. But this place don't care what you thought." The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable, just heavy shared. Darius reached into his pocket again, careful with the way he unfolded the picture, his movements slow, almost reverent. He held the photograph in his lap, thumb brushing over the creased edge of his mother's uniform, the outline of her face still strong despite the fading ink. Trey leaned forward, curious but not pushy. "That your mom?" he asked. "Yeah," Darius said softly. "She served. Army medic. Died when I was 9. I carry this everywhere." Trey nodded, his expression unreadable for a second. Then, barely above a whisper, he said, "My brother used to do that. Kept a photo of our dad in his shoe until the guards took it." Darius looked up. "What happened to him?" Trey's jaw shifted, eyes drifting toward the ceiling. "He was here. Couple years back. Same judge. Cormac. He got sentenced. 12 months. He never made it out." For a moment, neither of them spoke. It wasn't a silence born of fear, but of understanding, an invisible thread that stretched between them, anchored in the shared knowledge that sometimes the sentence didn't end when the time did. Darius turned the photo over, tracing the faint line where the paper had once been folded. "I keep thinking maybe this'll mean something. Maybe if they see her face, they'll see me different." Trey's eyes met his, and for a second, he looked like someone who wanted to believe it could be true. "You think they care who we come from?" he asked. "They already decided who we are." The words landed like truth, simple, unembellished, and devastatingly final. But Darius didn't fold the photo back up. Instead, he stared at it longer, as if willing it to become something more than memory. "I don't know," he said, "but it's all I've got left that reminds me I came from someone who mattered." Trey nodded slowly, his shoulders relaxing just enough to show that he understood. "Maybe that's enough," he said. "Maybe remembering who you are is the only thing they can't take." A few minutes passed in silence. Somewhere down the hallway, a guard's keys jingled against his belt, followed by the sharp click of a door being locked. The rhythm of institutional life carried on without urgency, without pause, without concern for who was inside the walls and who was out. Darius laid the photo carefully back inside the pocket of his pants, tucking it close to his thigh, like a piece of armor no one could see. He leaned back against the wall, the cool concrete pressing into his spine, and exhaled slowly through his nose. His thoughts drifted toward his grandmother again. He pictured her kitchen, the way her hands moved when she sliced apples, her quiet hum while boiling tea leaves the smell of cinnamon that always clung to the fabric of her sweaters. He wondered what she was doing at that very moment, whether she was sleeping or staring out the window with that look she wore when she was both praying and preparing for the worst. Then unexpectedly, Trey spoke again, softer this time. "You gonna fight it?" Darius turned to him. The case, Trey nodded. "The whole thing. The judge. The charges. The way they're trying to make you something you're not." Darius sat with the question for a moment, letting it move through him like wind against a closed window, quiet but undeniable. "Yeah," he said eventually. "I have to. Not just for me. For her. For my grandma. For anyone who's ever been told they don't matter." Trey stared at him for a long moment, then gave the smallest of nods, as if confirming something he'd suspected from the beginning. "Then don't stop," he said. "Even when it gets worse. Especially then." Darius nodded, letting the words settle into the space between them, not like a promise made under pressure, but like a truth discovered one breath at a time. Outside, the sky had begun to darken into that deep navy blue that comes just before dawn, when the world is quietest, and the day hasn't yet decided what it wants to be. The window in their cell was too small to see the stars, but the faintest breeze had begun to stir through the cracks in the frame, just enough to remind them that the world outside was still moving, even if their own had stopped for a while. And as Darius closed his eyes for the first time that night, it wasn't the cell he saw or the courtroom or the judge's eyes. It was his mother standing in that photograph, holding him close, the weight of her love pressed into the fabric of her uniform. And for the first time in days, the ache in his chest quieted just a little, like the beginning of something that hadn't yet broken. The morning sun had barely crested over the rooftops of Magnolia when Marcia Wells locked her front door with trembling fingers and stepped onto the sidewalk with a sense of purpose that masked the fear twisting in her gut. The air still carried a trace of night's coolness, but her palms were damp, and every step she took toward the community center felt like walking across the edge of something far bigger than herself. She clutched a worn leather handbag against her side, filled not with money or groceries, but with paper documents, photocopies, records, and fragments of something deeper. A truth she hoped would speak louder than the assumptions that had already swallowed her grandson whole. Inside the center, the light was harsh and fluorescent, casting long shadows across the beige tile floor. Reverend Thomas stood near the front desk, already in conversation with someone on the phone, his voice low and urgent, his free hand tracing circles over a folder thick with highlighted pages. When he saw Marcia step in, he nodded once, then ended the call with a clipped, "I'll get back to you." He greeted her with a warmth that didn't need words, only a brief touch to her shoulder and the quiet certainty in his voice when he said, "We're not too late." They moved to the back room where an old metal filing cabinet sat next to a printer that whirred faintly with every slow scan of the documents they fed through it. The room smelled faintly of dust and dry ink, and the table between them was covered in manila folders and legal pads, with scribbled notes from sleepless nights. Marcia opened her bag and began laying out each sheet with trembling care: school attendance records, character references from neighbors, copies of Darius's report cards and community service hours, and finally the photo. That same photo, worn from love and age, now placed at the center like a question waiting to be answered. Reverend Thomas sat down across from her, his fingers steepled under his chin, and studied each page with the quiet patience of someone who had long since learned that evidence alone wasn't enough when power had already chosen its story. "We have enough to raise questions," he said softly, "but if we want to force movement, we'll need a pattern. Not just one case, they'll call it an exception. We need more." Marcia's jaw tightened. "So we dig," she replied. "We don't stop until we find the line he's been crossing." And she meant it not just as a grandmother fighting for her grandson, but as a woman who had lived through too many quiet injustices to let this one pass without a name. She remembered the hushed conversations in beauty salons, the boys who disappeared into courtrooms and came back quieter, the mothers who sat in pews every Sunday with eyes that never quite met hers again. That afternoon, the two of them made calls. They visited homes, knocked on doors, and asked questions that made people pause before answering. At first, many were hesitant. Some had moved on, some had given up, and some had been burned too badly to reopen old wounds. But then someone remembered a boy named Malachi, who got 6 months for skipping school, and another remembered a girl named Nia, whose mother had filed a complaint about the same judge 10 years ago, only to see her daughter sent away on a truancy charge 3 weeks later. Piece by piece, the pattern began to reveal itself, not obvious, not overt, but consistent in its cruelty, like a quiet hand pressing down in the same direction over and over, until the weight became normal. By nightfall, they had a stack of names and a loose map of what Judge Cormack had left behind. A chain of rulings that disproportionately targeted black youth, each cloaked in the language of accountability and order, but lacking in both empathy and fairness. Reverend Thomas leaned back in his chair, his shoulders heavy, but his voice steady when he said, "This is bigger than just Darius now." Marcia didn't blink. It always was. At home that evening, she sat at the kitchen table beneath a weak yellow bulb, reviewing everything once more, each line of ink a lifeline she refused to let go of. Her house was silent, except for the occasional groan of the floorboards and the quiet rustling of trees outside. On the wall behind her hung a framed photo of her daughter in uniform, her hand resting on baby Darius's shoulder. Marcia stared at it for a long moment and whispered, "I'm doing what you would have done." Just then, her phone rang, and the screen lit up with a number she didn't recognize. She hesitated, then answered, voice cautious. "Hello?" On the other end, a deep male voice responded calmly, "Mrs. Wells, this is Officer Reed from the Magnolia Sheriff's Department. Just checking in, heard you've been asking around a lot lately." Marcia didn't speak. She didn't need to. The tone in his voice said more than the words. Reed continued, "Sometimes digging into things best left buried can cause more problems than they fix, just something to think about." She hung up without replying, her fingers cold around the phone. She sat still for a moment, heart beating, not from fear but from recognition. This wasn't just resistance, it was a warning. But warnings didn't carry the weight they used to, not when you'd already buried a child and were fighting to keep another from disappearing into the same silence. She stood, gathered the documents into her folder, and placed the photo on top. And as she zipped up the bag and turned off the light, she felt no dread, only clarity. The kind that came when there was nothing left to lose but the silence itself. And in the quiet that followed, the house stood firm. The photo remained centered, and Marcia's steps into the hallway were slow, steady, and unafraid. Sunday morning arrived in Magnolia the way it always did, slow, reverent, and wrapped in the soft hush of early church bells echoing across dew-covered streets. But inside Greater Mercy Baptist, the air pulsed with something far more urgent than ritual, something heavier than tradition. The sanctuary, usually quiet and modest in its energy, was alive, with murmurs and restless shifting as pews filled not just with congregants, but with neighbors, organizers, students, and elders, who had all heard that today's sermon wouldn't just be about salvation, it would be about justice. Reverend Thomas stood at the pulpit, his Bible closed beside him, his hands planted firmly on the worn wooden edge like an anchor. Behind him, the cross caught a slant of sunlight that filtered through the stained glass, bathing the altar in red and gold. He scanned the crowd not just for familiar faces, but for what was written between them, the worry etched in lined foreheads, the quiet fire in tightened jaws, the ache in eyes that had seen this kind of pain before. Then his gaze landed on Marcia Wells, seated in the third pew, the manila folder still clutched tight in her lap, her spine straight, her eyes dry. Next to her, a teenage girl held a handmade sign across her knees, "Justice for Darius." And behind them, a row of young men sat with arms crossed and shoulders squared, silent but present, like witnesses to something long overdue. The Reverend cleared his throat, not to quiet the room, it was already listening, but to steady his own voice. "There are moments," he said, "when silence is not peace. When being polite is not the same as being righteous, and when sitting still is just another way of agreeing with the system that's doing the harm." He paused, let the words settle. "Today we are not just a church, we are a voice, we are a mirror, and we are a storm." A quiet wave rippled through the congregation, soft murmurs, a few nods, someone whispering, "Amen," from the back row. Marcia didn't speak, didn't move, but her fingers tightened on the edge of the folder. She could feel the rhythm of her own heartbeat in her chest, each thump a reminder that she had brought more than prayers to this service. She had brought evidence, names, and a photograph that wouldn't stay quiet anymore. When the service ended, Reverend Thomas stepped down from the pulpit and met her at the center aisle, his voice lowered but urgent. "Are you ready?" he asked. Marcia nodded once. "I've been ready." The crowd parted slowly as they made their way to the small meeting hall behind the sanctuary, a space usually reserved for Sunday school and potlucks, now rearranged with folding chairs, a projector and stacks of flyers still warm from the printer. The first thing she did was lay the photo on the table, Darius as a baby in his mother's arms, Renee in uniform smiling proud. Then came the documents, court records, testimonies, timelines, a list of names of other young people caught in the same trap, all connected by a pattern too clear to be coincidence. The room filled quickly, parents, community leaders, volunteers from out of town, and 2 reporters from the local news station who had started sniffing around after hearing about the denied bail and the judge's reputation. People didn't shout, they didn't argue. They listened, they asked questions, and more than once, someone whispered a name they hadn't said out loud in years. By the time the clock struck 3, the strategy had begun to take shape. A press release would go out in the morning. The files would be submitted to the Judicial Review Board before noon. Protests would begin outside the courthouse by the end of the week. Not angry mobs, but a wall of witnesses, each holding a photo, a name, a date, a memory. As the energy in the room built, Marcia stood near the window, looking out at the street, her hands finally empty the folder resting on the table behind her. "They're going to push back," she said quietly, almost to herself. "Harder than we expect," Reverend Thomas nodded. "Let them push. But this time we're standing up." That night, as she walked home alone, the wind had picked up just enough to rustle the trees along Sycamore Street, the same street where Darius had once ridden his bike, his backpack bouncing lightly against his shoulders. The sidewalks were quiet, the windows mostly dark, but the silence no longer felt like defeat. It felt like breath held before a shout, like the stillness before a march, like something was shifting slowly, surely unavoidably. At home, she boiled water for tea without turning on the television. She sat in the kitchen with the lights low, the mug warming her hands, and stared at the family photo now pinned to the refrigerator door with a magnet shaped like Georgia. It was a small thing, but it felt right to place it there at the center of the house, where it could not be ignored. She thought of Darius in his cell, how he must be curled up on that narrow cot, eyes open in the dark, wondering what would come next. She wanted to tell him what had happened today, how people showed up, how strangers leaned in, how voices rose without shouting. She wanted to tell him he had sparked something that could not be put back where it came from. But for now she just sat with the quiet. Not the kind that hides, but the kind that waits steady, focused, unafraid. Outside, a streetlight buzzed to life, casting a warm, yellow halo over the front steps. And in that soft glow, Marcia closed her eyes for a moment and allowed herself the smallest smile, not because the fight was over, but because it had finally begun on her terms. The morning of the second hearing arrived, cloaked in the kind of silence that didn't come from peace, but from preparation, the quiet that settles before a fight, when everyone knows what's at stake, but says little out loud. Darius sat on the thin cot in his cell, already dressed in the same county-issued clothes hands, resting on his lap as if he were trying to remind them to stay still. The air was cooler than usual, a slight draft whispering through the vents high above the barred window, but it wasn't the chill that made his skin feel tight, it was the weight of what waited on the other side of that transport van in a courtroom where eyes watched but didn't see. When the guard came to collect him, she didn't speak, only nodded once and gestured with her head. He stood without a word, cuffs clicking into place like punctuation, at the end of a sentence he hadn't written. The ride downtown was quiet, the usual hum of tires on asphalt, broken only by the occasional radio dispatch that buzzed through the speakers with static-laced urgency. Darius kept his gaze on the passing streets, familiar neighborhoods blurring past in gray morning light laundromats, with flickering signs, corner stores with iron gates and school buses starting their slow crawl toward places where he was supposed to be. Outside the courthouse, the scene had changed. Where once there were only a few scattered onlookers and reporters glancing at their phones, now stood a line of people holding signs, standing shoulder to shoulder in the early sun, their breath visible in the crisp morning air. Some held photos of their own children, others carried handmade posters with phrases like, "We are watching" and "Justice for Darius." A few wore clerical collars. A few wore t-shirts printed with names and dates like memorials turned into protest. And they were silent, not shouting, not chanting, but standing in stillness, a kind of presence that demanded to be acknowledged without needing to make noise. From inside the van, Darius caught sight of them through the sliver of tinted glass, and for a moment something in his chest shifted, not relief, not joy, but recognition. He didn't know their names, but they had chosen to stand there for him anyway. That mattered more than he had words for. Inside the courtroom buzzed with tension, barely hidden beneath routine. Reporters filled the back row, their cameras resting in their laps like coiled snakes, waiting for the moment that would turn into a headline. Celeste Rankin sat at the defense table, flipping through a folder that looked even heavier than before, her fingers tapping the table's edge in a rhythm she probably didn't realize she'd fallen into. Reverend Thomas sat behind her, his eyes locked on the judge's bench, and next to him Marcia Wells held her handbag tight against her knees, the knuckles of her hands pale from the grip. Her face was calm, but her eyes never stopped moving, scanning the room like a mother counting exits. When Judge Cormack entered, the murmurs died instantly, the room rising out of ritual rather than respect. He moved slower this time, as if something in the air weighed him down, and when he sat, he took a moment longer than usual before speaking. This hearing, he began, his voice low but clear, will address the defense's request for dismissal, based on claims of procedural misconduct and bias. He looked up, but not at anyone in particular. Proceed. Celeste stood, her voice steady, her presence firmer than before. Your Honor, we are not just asking for dismissal, we are demanding that this courtroom recognize a pattern of systemic bias that has placed an innocent child behind bars. She paused, glanced at Darius, then continued. We now have multiple affidavits, former case files, and internal documentation that reveal a disturbing history of disproportionate sentencing in this courtroom, particularly against black youth. Cormac's expression didn't shift, but something behind his eyes flickered, uncertainty maybe, or resistance pressed too tightly against facts that refused to stay buried. These are serious allegations, he said flatly. The court requires proof, not sentiment. Celeste nodded. Which we've provided in Exhibits D through H, including rulings in 27 prior cases, all under your docket, all involving underage defendants of color, all resulting in maximum sentencing despite minimal evidence. The courtroom didn't gasp. It didn't need to. The silence that followed was louder than any outburst. Then Darius stood, not abruptly, not in defiance, but in something closer to resolve. Your Honor, he said, his voice low but unwavering, I know you've already decided who you think I am. But I need you to see this. He reached into the pocket of his pants and carefully unfolded the photograph, his fingers slow, deliberate. The bailiff moved toward him, but the judge raised a hand. Let him speak, he said quietly. Darius held up the photo, his voice steady. This is my mom, Renee Wells. She served this country, saved lives, and raised me to tell the truth even when nobody wanted to hear it. He stepped closer, the chain between his cuffs rattling softly. And that's me in her arms. That's who I am. Not a file, not a case number, not a problem you can send away. He extended the photo toward the bench, and the judge hesitated before taking it his hand, pausing mid-air before closing around the worn edges. He stared at the image for longer than anyone expected, and when he looked up again, his face was paler than it had been when he entered the room. Celeste spoke again, her voice quieter now but still firm. We ask that the charges be dropped immediately, and that this child be released today. Every moment he remains detained is a continuation of an injustice you now have the power to end. The judge set the photo down gently, his hand lingering over it like he wasn't sure whether to let go. Then he leaned back, his expression unreadable, and after a long pause he said simply, This court will recess for 15 minutes. He rose, turned without another word, and disappeared behind the chamber's door, leaving the room thick with a silence that pulsed with disbelief. Darius stood there, unmoving, watching the bench where the man had just sat. He didn't smile. He didn't cry. He just breathed deep, slow, steady, as if for the first time in weeks his lungs remembered what full air felt like. Marcia stood and crossed the room toward him, and when the bailiff hesitated, she said clearly, That's my grandson. Then she reached for him, pulled him close, and held him the way his mother would have, arms wrapped fully around his shoulders, her voice whispering only 3 words. You were brave. And for the first time in all the silence, Darius allowed his eyes to close, not in retreat but in release. The courtroom had fallen into a heavy silence, the kind that hangs thick like humidity in the summer air, making every breath feel dense and deliberate. Darius stood at the center, his hands unclasped but trembling slightly as he clutched the worn photograph of his mother, feeling the rough edges press into his palm like a lifeline. Around him, every eye was fixed, reporters with notepads, poised lawyers shifting papers nervously, and the judge, whose stern facade seemed to falter ever so briefly beneath the weight of truth, now staring him in the face. The colors from the stained glass windows spilled in irregular patterns over the polished floor, casting kaleidoscopic shapes that contrasted sharply with the stark black robes and austere walls. Taking a slow breath, Darius lifted the photo higher, his voice steady despite the quiver he fought to keep at bay. "This is my mom, Renee Wells," he began the words, carrying the gravity of a promise made long ago but only now spoken aloud. "She served this country with honor, saved lives, and raised me to stand for what's right, even when no one else would listen." His eyes scanned the room, settling on the judge's gaze, once so cold and dismissive, now visibly unsettled. "This photo isn't just a picture. It's proof of who I am, where I come from, and why I refuse to be defined by assumptions or fear." The courtroom held its breath as the judge's hand trembled slightly, his fingers brushing over the faded image, as if hoping it would change beneath his gaze. Whispers rippled through the crowd, not loud enough to break the solemn air, but loud enough to thread through the thick fabric of tension that wrapped the space. Celeste Rankin stepped forward, her voice quieter now but infused with a quiet strength that only came from battles fought and truths upheld. "Your Honor, we submit this evidence to demonstrate the systemic bias that has influenced this case, and many others like it, disproportionately affecting young black defendants who deserve fair treatment under the law." Judge Cormac's lips pressed into a thin line, his eyes narrowing as he flicked through the accompanying documents handed to him by the bailiff. The air felt charged, like the moment before a storm breaks open and scatters everything in its path. The judge's face, once a mask of impassivity, now revealed a flicker of something, recognition perhaps, or unease, as the truth pressed against the veneer of control he so carefully maintained. From the gallery, Marcia Wells' hands tightened into fists, her breathing shallow but steady, her eyes locked on her grandson with fierce determination and silent encouragement. Reverend Thomas, standing nearby, clutched his Bible close to his chest, nodding ever so slightly, as if to remind everyone present that justice was more than a word, it was a calling. The murmurs among the crowd swelled gently, voices rising, not in anger but in unity, a collective acknowledgement that something deep and necessary was unfolding. The prosecutor rose abruptly, his voice sharp but faltering slightly under the weight of the evidence now laid bare. "Your Honor, this appears to be a desperate attempt to derail proceedings with sentimentality," he argued, sweeping his gaze over the courtroom as if daring anyone to challenge him. "The defendant was found at the scene, and there is a pattern of behavior that cannot be ignored. We must uphold the law, not be swayed by emotional appeals." But the words fell flat against the growing conviction in the room, a reminder that justice is never blind when it chooses whom to favor. Judge Cormac swallowed hard, his fingers tightening around the edge of the bench, and for a moment the courtroom was suspended in time, every heart beating in sync with the slow tick of the wall clock. Then finally he cleared his throat, his voice hollow, yet commanding. "This court will recess for 15 minutes, he announced, his gavel hovering uncertainly before striking the wooden desk with a thud that echoed through the silence. As the judge stood and turned away, the courtroom erupted into a subdued buzz of disbelief and cautious hope. Darius lowered the photo, his hands shaking less, now his chest rising and falling with a breath of relief that was tempered by the knowledge that this was not the end but a turning point. He met his grandmother's eyes as she rose, moving toward him with a resolve that seemed to fill the entire room. When she embraced him, her voice broke through the quiet like a hymn. "You were brave," she whispered, tears tracing gentle paths down her cheeks. For a moment, Darius let himself lean into that, embrace the strength and love of family wrapping around him tighter than any chain could. He felt the warmth of hope flicker to life within, not as a distant dream but as a tangible force, ready to guide him through the battles yet to come. And as the room slowly emptied, leaving behind only the echoes of footsteps and the fading light, he stood there still, steady, unbroken, ready to carry the truth forward no matter the cost. The quiet that settled over Marcia's neighborhood the night after the hearing was unlike any she had ever known. It wasn't the gentle peace that follows a long day, nor the sleepy calm of a town lulled by routine. This silence was heavier thick with an unspoken warning that had begun to weave itself through the streets like a shadow moving just beyond the edge of sight. As she sat in her small living room, the faint hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the old wooden floor were the only sounds keeping her company, but outside the wind carried something darker, whispers, footfalls, and the subtle scrape of unfamiliar shoes on gravel. Earlier that evening, as the sky turned from blue to the deep indigo of dusk, Marcia had noticed strange lights flickering near the church parking lot. She had stepped outside, wrapped in her worn cardigan, and seen the telltale spray of paint on the side of the sanctuary's brick wall, ugly, hateful symbols that tore at the calm she'd tried so hard to maintain. The words scrawled there were not just vandalism. They were a message meant to chill, to remind her that standing up had consequences. Her hands trembled as she took out her phone to capture the damage the camera flash illuminating the graffiti's hateful script against the stained bricks. Later, when she returned inside, the quiet was broken by the sharp ring of the telephone, a sound that immediately set her nerves on edge. The voice on the other end was low and unfamiliar, cautious but clear. "Mrs. Wells, this is Officer Peters from the Magnolia Sheriff's Department. I wanted to inform you that your property may be a target given the recent events. We recommend extra precautions." Marcia's heart sank, but she kept her voice steady. "Thank you, officer. I appreciate the warning." The line went dead before she could say more, leaving her with the cold weight of isolation. But the threats didn't stop at words and symbols. A few nights later, as Marcia sat reading a worn Bible on her front porch, she heard the sharp hiss of tires and the low rumble of a car engine that didn't belong. She looked up to see a dark sedan slowly circling the block, its windows tinted too heavily for her to see inside. The car paused in front of her house, then drove away without a sound, leaving only the faint echo of its passage on the empty street. Marcia didn't move until the taillights disappeared around the corner, and when she finally went back inside, the silence was heavier still. Meanwhile, Celeste Rankin, working late into the night at the legal aid office, was dealing with her own share of pressure. Phone calls from anonymous numbers, emails threatening the release of confidential client information, and late-night knocks at her office door had become part of her routine. But no amount of intimidation would deter her from the fight she had chosen. "They think fear will shut us up," she told Reverend Thomas during a late meeting. "But this is bigger than any one of us. It's about the truth, and truth has a way of shining through even the darkest places." Reverend Thomas nodded solemnly, his voice low but resolute. "We stand with them," he said, "and with all who face this system's cruelty. We must protect this community or no one else will." The determination in the room was tangible, a shared fire fueled not by anger, but by deep, unyielding love and commitment. The next morning, Marcia awoke to find her mailbox had been torn open, the letters strewn across the walkway like fallen leaves. Among the scattered papers was a single note hastily scrawled, "Stay out of it, or next time it'll be worse." The message felt less like a threat and more like a decree, but Marcia folded the note carefully, placing it in her Bible with the others, and she whispered aloud, "They forget who raised me." Word of the intimidation spread quickly through the community, sparking quiet conversations in barbershops, kitchens, and church basements. People who had once remained silent now spoke of fear and frustration, but also of solidarity and courage. Plans for peaceful rallies and community watches began to form, each person determined to stand as a witness against the injustice that had sought to divide them. Despite the dangers, Marcia continued her daily routines, attending meetings, visiting neighbors, and speaking out with a voice steady enough to inspire others. Each evening she would call Darius, her words filled with strength and reassurance, even when her own heart ached with the knowledge of what awaited him. "Hold on to who you are," she told him one night. "They can try to break you, but they can't take what's inside your soul." Darius listened in the quiet of his cell, her voice a tether that kept him connected to the world beyond the walls. He pictured her hands worn but steady, and the determined set of her jaw as she faced the storm outside. It gave him a flicker of hope, a fragile flame in the darkness that he clung to fiercely. As days turned into weeks, the community's resolve only grew stronger. And though the threats continued, some more direct, others subtle, the collective spirit of those who refused to be silenced became a force that could not be ignored. Marcia's home, once a place shadowed by fear, now stood as a beacon of unwavering courage, a reminder that even in the face of hatred, love and justice could not be extinguished. And so, beneath the watchful eyes of those who had once whispered threats in the night, a new story began to take shape. One, not of fear and silence, but of resilience, unity, and the unbreakable bond between a grandmother's love and a boy's fight for justice. The days that followed the courthouse standoff were a mixture of quiet victories and cautious steps forward, as the wheels of the justice system began to turn in ways that felt both promising and precarious. News had spread beyond Magnolia, carried by local reporters who had come to see the case as a reflection of a broader struggle, and by community organizers who believed that Darius's story was not just his own but a voice for many who had been silenced. When the state appointed a new judge to review the case, it marked a turning point not just in the courtroom but in the hearts of those who had been fighting in the shadows. Marcia sat in her living room, the window open to a soft spring breeze that carried the scent of blooming jasmine and freshly cut grass. Her hands rested on the edge of a wooden table worn smooth by years of use, and her eyes, still clear and sharp, despite the nights spent pacing in worry, were fixed on the small television screen where the news anchor spoke of the judicial review. In a rare move, the reporter said Judge Luther Cormack has been suspended pending an ethics investigation related to allegations of bias and disproportionate sentencing in juvenile cases. Marcia let out a slow breath, the kind that carries the weight of hope and the exhaustion of battles fought. Across town, Darius sat in a cramped meeting room at the community center, surrounded by people whose faces had become familiar through the course of the fight: neighbors, lawyers, activists, and clergy. They gathered around a table strewn with papers, phones buzzing with messages of support and strategy. Celeste Rankin stood at the front, her voice steady as she outlined the next steps, the legal maneuvers, and the importance of vigilance. "This isn't just about one judge," she reminded the group. "It's about accountability at every level. We have a chance to make real change." The room echoed with quiet agreement, but beneath the surface, the tension of uncertainty lingered like a low hum. One afternoon, Marcia received a call that made her hands tremble and her heart skip a beat. It was from a representative of the Judicial Review Board, confirming the suspension of Judge Cormack and informing her that a new hearing would be scheduled with the newly appointed judge. "We're taking this seriously," the voice said. "Your evidence was compelling, and we're committed to fairness." Marcia thanked the caller, her voice steady despite the flood of emotions surging beneath her calm exterior. "Thank you for hearing us," she said softly, for seeing him as more than a file. Meanwhile, Darius prepared for the day he would return to court, this time with a chance for his voice to be heard in a system that had so far spoken over him. He spent hours with Celeste reviewing documents, practicing what to say, and building the courage that had been tested so many times but never broken. On quiet evenings, he would hold the photograph of his mother, close, drawing strength from the woman who had fought battles far beyond what he could see, and from the grandmother who had never let him forget who he was. The community's response was more than words. It was a movement. Volunteers organized rides to court, letters flooded the judge's chambers, and social media campaigns brought national attention to the case. Marcia watched as strangers from distant cities sent messages of solidarity, reminding her that the fight for justice was never isolated. "You're not alone," one email read. "We stand with you." On the morning of the new hearing, the courthouse buzzed with a different energy, more hopeful, more attentive. The press packed the room, and the benches were filled with supporters wearing shirts that read "Justice for Darius" and holding signs that carried names of others who had suffered similar fates. Marcia sat near the front, her posture unwavering, her eyes scanning the room for the boy she loved. When the new judge took the bench, she was a woman in her early 50s with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and an air of calm authority. Her voice was measured as she introduced herself and explained the purpose of the hearing: to review the case impartially and ensure justice was served. Celeste stood and presented the evidence again, this time with renewed confidence and clarity, highlighting the pattern of bias, the flawed procedures, and most importantly, the humanity of Darius. As the hearing progressed, the atmosphere shifted. Witnesses spoke, experts testified, and the weight of facts began to settle where assumptions once ruled. The new judge listened intently, asking thoughtful questions that showed a commitment to understanding rather than judgment. When it was Darius's turn, he spoke clearly, telling his story without fear, his voice carrying the weight of every struggle he had faced and every hope he still held. After hours that felt like an eternity, the judge retired to deliberate. The courtroom emptied slowly, and Marcia sat back, her hands folded, a quiet prayer on her lips. When the judge returned, the room held its breath. After careful consideration, she began. This court finds that the charges against Darius Wells are not supported by sufficient evidence, and that his continued detention would be unjust. A murmur rippled through the crowd, growing into a wave of relief and disbelief. Darius felt the shackles release from his wrists and the weight of months lift from his shoulders like a storm passing over a heavy sky. His grandmother rushed forward, embracing him with tears and laughter mingled into one. "You're free," she whispered, "and so is your future." The community erupted in quiet celebration, their voices joined in a chorus of hope and resolve. But even as they left the courthouse, the journey was far from over. The suspension of Judge Cormac marked a victory, yes, but also a call to vigilance and change. Marcia looked out at the crowd, her eyes shining with determination. "This is just the beginning," she said softly. "For Darius, for every child, and for every family fighting to be heard." And as the sun set over Magnolia, casting long shadows over the streets they had walked together, a new chapter was written, one not defined by fear or silence, but by courage, justice, and the unyielding power of a community united. The morning air was cool, but carried the weight of a promise unfulfilled. As Darius stood quietly beside his grandmother at the edge of the cemetery, their breaths visible in the early dawn light, the gravel crunched softly beneath their feet, and around them the world seemed to hold its breath, as if the very earth understood the significance of this moment. Ahead lay the worn headstone of Renee Wells, a woman whose presence lingered in the soft rustle of leaves and the distant call of a mourning bird. Marcia reached out her fingers, brushing against Darius's arm, steady and reassuring despite the tremor that coursed through her own heart. "This is where we remember," she whispered, voice thick with years of love and loss. Darius nodded, his gaze fixed on the inscription, tracing the letters as if reading a secret meant only for them. For a long moment they stood in silence, the only sounds the wind threading through the trees and the soft sigh of the world waking around them. Darius's thoughts drifted not to the pain of absence but to the legacy his mother had left behind, etched not just in stone but in the strength he carried within him. "She wanted me to fight," he said quietly, voice barely above the breeze. "Not just for me, for everyone like me." Marcia smiled, eyes shining with pride and sorrow intertwined. "And fight you will," she said firmly, "because giving up is not what we do." In the weeks that followed, Darius began to channel the storm inside him into action. With Celeste's guidance and the support of Reverend Thomas and the community, he started a project, a space for young people who had been silenced, marginalized, or lost in the shadows of a broken system. The walls of the community center echoed with new voices, stories shared, pain acknowledged, and hope nurtured. Workshops, meetings, and quiet moments of solidarity filled the calendar, each gathering a thread, weaving a tapestry of resilience and renewal. One afternoon, as the sun dipped low behind the magnolia trees lining Sycamore Street, Darius sat with a group of teenagers, their faces illuminated by the soft glow of a projector. They listened as he spoke not just of his own journey but of the power in telling one's story. "We can't change the past," he told them, "but we can shape the future. One word, one voice, one action at a time." The room was still absorbing the weight of his words before a slow ripple of nods and murmurs spread through the crowd. It was a moment of connection, a spark of something that neither fear nor injustice could extinguish. At home, Marcia watched Darius with a mixture of awe and quiet relief. The boy who had once walked the streets with his head down now held himself with a new kind of strength, a determination that radiated beyond words. She kept the family photo on the mantel, a daily reminder of the journey they had traveled and the road still ahead. "You've come so far," she said one evening, reaching out to tuck a loose strand of hair behind his ear, "and you're just getting started." Darius smiled, a small, genuine curve that lit up his face. "I'm not just fighting for me anymore," he said. "I'm fighting for all of us." And in that moment, beneath the soft light of the living room, surrounded by the warmth of home and the echoes of his mother's love, he knew the fight was worth every sacrifice. Outside, the world continued to turn, carrying with it the stories of countless others who faced their own battles. But here in this small corner of Magnolia, a new story was being written, one of courage, community, and the unbreakable bonds that hold us all together. Life often tests us in ways we never expect, especially when faced with injustice and hardship. But what this story reminds us, especially to those of us who've lived through many seasons, is that strength doesn't always roar. Sometimes it's the quiet courage to keep going, to hold on to hope even when the world seems stacked against us. It teaches us the power of standing up not just for ourselves, but for those who cannot speak for themselves, and how love and community can be the strongest shields against adversity. For those of us who have seen change come slowly, this story is a call to never underestimate the impact one voice, one action, one act of kindness can have. It's a reminder that, no matter our age, we can be part of the healing, the fighting, and the building of a better future. The legacy we leave is not just in what we endure, but in how we respond with resilience, with compassion, and with unwavering hope. So to everyone listening, especially those in the golden years, remember your wisdom, your stories, and your strength are more valuable than ever. Keep sharing them. Keep standing tall, because sometimes that's exactly what changes the world. If this message touched your heart, please like this video and subscribe to our channel for more stories that inspire and uplift. Your support means the world to us. Thank you for being part of this community.